but okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcelo, and today I'll be presenting part of my thoughts in the analysis that I'm working on my master's degree dissertation. We'll be presenting this paper called Pottery Decoration as Resistance, the Effects of Eurocentric Capitalism in Enslaved Production. First of all, I'm going to show you that we are moving a bit far away from what we were working on in the previous papers. We're going to São Paulo, Brazil, that little red dot over there in southeast Brazil. And this is the municipality of São Paulo with all the archaeological sites that have been currently identified and the archaeological occurrences in green. But I'll be working on that little red lines over there. Taking a closer look, I'll be discussing these three sites over here in yellow. Their names are Pinheiros 2, Casa do Bandeirante, Casa do Itaim. These last two, Casa means house. They are two colonial houses from early 1600s, colonial period. Why were these sites chosen? Well, the main research focus of my dissertation is observing production and distribution of pottery. And Pinheiros 2 site is the only colonial pottery works ever unearthed in São Paulo. So to see if the pottery that was being produced there was being sold close by, we analyzed their two sites with domestic contexts, two colonial houses, all of which have similar dates as Pinheiros, which trace back to the very beginning of Portuguese colonization in the region, which started in 1544. So, what happens when people that produce solely for subsistence get in contact with a market-based society? Well, things change, especially the dynamics behind the craft. There's an elevated production, there's the use of several kilns, since the indigenous peoples only used kilns for their own subsistence, so it's common to see in indigenous context only one kiln, maybe two. This place, they had 9. They had 9 in a very, very small location, so it's quite unusual. And there's also elevated production, and when you start speeding up production of pottery, several mistakes start occurring, which we'll be discussing later. And several of these aspects have been discussed in Sinopolis' book, when she described a workshop industry context, which means an increase in scale of production, changes in ceramic technology, production with the use of wheel or molding, the introduction of kilns, standardized production, and specialized artisans. But that isn't all. Another change that occurs frequently is that foreign objects, such as metals, faience, and glass, also start to appear in these sites. The concept of buying and selling too, since it creates a discrepancy between basic needs and what the population needs, and what the market needs. They are completely different things. There's also a drastic change in the hierarchy of power. Indigenous societies in Brazil frequently don't have imposed hierarchies. And with the introduction of capitalism, this concept becomes quite aggressive. People that produced ceramics were still the indigenous peoples. The Portuguese weren't putting their hands in the clay. Who were still the enslaved indigenous peoples that were doing that. So when they started, these indigenous people stopped producing for themselves and started producing with oversights, with deadlines, and a market to attend. Here we can see 6 of the 9 pit kilns that were found in Pinheiros. I prefer to choose these ones because they are the ones in better shape. The other 3 aren't quite as visible. And this is a drawing that it was made during field work of a reimagining of the landscape during the period that the workshop was in function. As you can see, that the pit kilns were over there, and the village being situated close by. Errors in production. This occurs very, very frequently. There are finger marks inside the pots that weren't properly smoothed. There are appliques that were poorly finished, some of them not even fully attached. And the temper that was being chosen for the pottery was frequently not crushed enough. Sometimes it appeared in very, very large pebbles inside the cross cut of the pottery. These are also some of the foreign objects that can be found when we work in this context. We found faience, we find coins, we find belt buckles and other metals. That crucifix is especially interesting because that Spanish crucifix, I actually got to find it in a Spanish catalog, and it's it actually comes from southern Spain, and it's dated from early 1700s. That also that pottery with a Maltese cross, it's also quite different. But the dynamics of production weren't the only thing that changed. The shapes and decorations, they also changed quite a bit. And it's important to understand that decoration in pottery is more than just for art's sake. There are channels which society plants their own values into the individual into their everyday meal times. So when we started to see several motifs, over 70 combinations of different motifs that present this mixture between Portuguese, African, and indigenous patterns. For example, the red engobe. These two examples over here are taken from pre-colonial sites. I believe this from early 1300s, perhaps 1200s. And these are examples from the pottery that I found in the three sites I was working on. You can see the similarity is absolutely, it's very, very similar. Production by cording. The indigenous peoples in Brazil, they produced a lot by cording. And in some examples here, they used cording as decoration. You can see the first two examples, they have exposed cords. And in the other three examples, you can see them as a forming technique. You can see the swirl over there. Here you can see the positive part of the cord and the negative one in the other side. And these are one of the troublesome parts when we are dealing with this context. These motifs with the diamond patterns, they are very, very common. They're one of the most common motifs that we have. And they appear constantly in indigenous contexts in several widespread over Brazil. These sorts of motifs. However, when we started looking into African contexts that came a little bit after, we noticed that they also did it. They also had these very, very similar motifs. However, we have to look at this with certain caution, because São Paulo wasn't a very well-connected city by early 1600s. It wasn't a Rio de Janeiro, wasn't a Salvador. It was a little bit far off. And so we have historical records that point out that the first African slaves arrived in São Paulo only by 1612. And they only became a primary part of the workforce by the 1700s, because the Portuguese destroyed all the indigenous populations in a range of about 300 kilometers around. So they had to find another sort of workforce. So the dates that we have for these sites should present themselves to point out to indigenous contexts rather than African contexts. Brushed motifs that are common in indigenous contexts also appear quite frequently. These three sites, these first three images, were taken from indigenous sites. Some of them over 1,000 years old, and these examples over here are also from the sites I've been working on. The Bakongo cosmograms, these were a pickle for me because this actually is a single piece. This appeared in only one of the sites, only one time, and this one is probably associated. It's most definitely associated with African influences. How it got there, perhaps how it got to this context, it's hard to know. But perhaps there was, perhaps the stratigraphy got in trouble. It came from a later date, but I can't be scientifically prove anything. The production by molding is, it was probably brought by the Portuguese, because our indigenous communities did not produce by molding. Here you can see some of the midsections of the pottery. Some of them you can actually see where this midsection is, and in some other cases you can see the breakage point where there was the switch to finish the remainder of the vessel. They created a very straight line breakage right in the middle. The curved lines, they are very much associated with the Portuguese, because no indigenous communities ever worked with these sorts of motifs. And these sorts of motifs appeared in Portugal from the 1300s up to the 19th century, and they, in very similar fashion, they appeared in the Brazilian pottery and appear in faience also. These sorts of appliques with grooves and stylized handles with depressions and finger marks also appear in Portuguese contexts, but they were also not common among the indigenous peoples in Brazil. And when you work with sites that had an European market to attend, we had to sometimes create shapes that were adapted to Portuguese needs. And this is where we come to when we start seeing European shapes. I can assure you that no indigenous peoples in Brazil ever made cake pots or jars or frying pans, but in these sites they start to appear. And now this is where we get where it gets a little bit confusing and starts getting to show how much these influences started to mix. Because we started seeing so many combined patterns. Diamond patterns with curved lines, brushed patterns with appliques, grooves and diamond patterns and brushed patterns. It was a combination that, so many variations that they did. And this sort of, these motifs, they were long lasting. So, as we've seen throughout this presentation, we managed to see that these motifs possess a lot of variety, as well as a combination between characteristics of distinct cultures. What is important to note is that these patterns were very long-lasting. They can be seen in the archaeological record up to the 19th and 20th centuries. In some traditional communities, some of these motifs can still be seen today, and are being studied through ethnoarchaeological works. What is interesting to see here is that these motifs show a fusion of cultures, some of which we can call a mameluca culture, which is the widespread term when referring to the cultural mix between indigenous societies in Brazil and their European colonizers. This persistence in decoration can be attributed to a way of resistance developed by the artisans, a way of maintaining some of their traditional identities. Even though their production dynamics were changed, some of their original traits would persist. What was being produced wasn't simply imitations of Portuguese material culture, it was something new. And it's very important to look at these productions and see the artisans as active agents in a colonized society. Even though they were oppressed and forced into labor, their culture found a way to change and influence the colonizer. Traditional, unchanged Portuguese pottery is very uncommon. And what's most common in the archaeological record is a combination of influences. It is also important to note that these motifs didn't fade. This means the Portuguese were also changed in this new environment, especially when you are in a place with few resources and when most of the inhabitants are natives. For example, by the 1670s, there were about 12,000 people living in São Paulo. However, only 3,000 of those were considered white Europeans. Culture change isn't one-sided. The oppressed have agency, still fight back, and it's about time this is acknowledged. Here, I can throw you a few examples of pottery today, what's being worked on today. You can see the diamond patterns, sometimes the diamond patterns are still in existence in several places in Brazil. For example, this is Pará, in the north of Brazil. The motifs in the Amazon, we can see that those zigzags also exist. We also see the curved lines in Ceará. We also see the diamond patterns also appearing in pottery in Mato Grosso. We also see these zigzags in Minas Gerais. And we can all end in Sao Paulo, even though we cannot see potters in Sao Paulo still maintaining those diamond patterns, we see that in weaves, in weaves worked on by traditional communities today. Well, these are the references. I would also like to acknowledge, to thank the EAA and Serena for accepting my paper, and also to Oscar Montecillo's grant, which allowed me to be here today. Also to the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the University of Sao Paulo, which I'm currently finishing my research. To my scientific advisor, which is here in Bern, but unfortunately her table is exactly at the same time as mine, so she couldn't be here. and for CAPES that financed my project throughout these years. Thank you.